Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure being back to see you guys again and to be here in spring and at a time when I feel like there's a little bit more room for hope. After, I don't know about how your year's been, but my year's been long, and I think that is kind of where we all are. So, and now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. I bet most of you know today's opening words. They come from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in a passage that I would guess is more widely read at Christian weddings than any other. But the modern translations, you will mostly hear the Greek text translated as faith, hope, and love rather than faith, hope, and charity. I chose to use the old-fashioned translation from King James Bible of 1611 because my topic today is charity, and I want to talk to you about what it means to be charitable and whether it is in fact a good idea to be charitable. I want to weave together two strands of thinking about charity. The first concerns charity as a Christian virtue, and the second as a philosophical principle. Let's begin by thinking a bit about the history of Christian charity. The word the King James translators rendered as charity is the Greek word agape. Greek has a number of words for love: eros for romantic or sexual love, philia for non-sexual love between friends, storge for love between parents and children. But agape was the word St. Paul and the evangelists used to describe the love that God has for us and the love we should have for God and for others. Here are a few celebrated verses in which the word agape figures prominently. From the Gospel of Matthew, "But I say unto you, love your enemies. And also, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like to it, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And from the Gospel of John, "Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." And also, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son." In all of those cases, the word love is agape. When the Greek Bible was translated into Latin in the 4th century, the Greek agape became the Latin caritas, and it is from caritas that we get the English word charity. The nature of charity is a subject of much discussion in Christian theology since the early Middle Ages. It has been considered the greatest of the 7 Christian virtues, what St. Thomas Aquinas called the friendship of man for God. I won't try to say exactly what Christian charity is, but what I take the core of this charity, but I take the core of this sense of charity to be a regard for the value of the other, a willingness to sacrifice for another, a seeing of a good or the divine in the other. And while I've drawn from this Christian tradition of talking about charity, I think you see similar conceptions in a variety of religious traditions. The way the word charity is used in contemporary philosophy is, on the face of it, quite different. Two prominent 20th century philosophers, Willard Van Orman Quine and Donald Davidson, each articulated versions of what they called the principle of charity. But this principle was not a moral principle, but rather a principle of interpretation. It guides how you should interpret the statements that people make, and more broadly, the beliefs, desires, and motives that you attribute to them. One way to state the principle is this: always interpret a person's statements in such a way as to attribute to them beliefs that are as true and as rational as possible. The principle is also a principle for interpreting texts. In reading a text, interpret the statements or arguments in a way to make it most likely to make them true and rationally defensible. To illustrate, let's go back to Jesus' advice to love thy enemies. What could this statement mean? Is Jesus advising that we should have erotic feelings for them? Certainly not. Is he advising that we should trust them in the ways that we trust our partners, our family members, our friends? Probably not this either. It seems best to interpret it as advice to recognize the value and worth of your enemies, to see your humanity, their humanity. Our enemies are, like us, made in God's image. This is the charitable way to interpret Jesus' command. Charitable both because on this interpretation, Jesus' words seem more likely to be wise and true. Charitable also because this interpretation of Jesus' words is most consistent with other things he is reported to have said in the gospel texts. A much broader question of biblical interpretation concerns what should be taken literally. Genesis, for instance, reports that Noah lived a total of 950 years and had his first son when he was 500 years old. Should we understand this part of Genesis as a literal truth? Was there really a man named Noah, and did he really live to this age? For many biblical interpreters dating back to antiquity, it is seen that the most charitable interpretation of Genesis and of many biblical texts is to read them figuratively. People living to near 1,000 years old are contrary to all of our experiences, so reading it literally would imply that the biblical authors were lying and making stuff up. If we read the text as doing something else, we can honor its truth and its sacredness without committing ourselves to its authors to absurdities. The principle of charity is a principle of great import to philosophers. Much of what we do and what we teach our students is to read texts and to identify claims and arguments. It is especially important to interpret these texts charitably if we disagree with their conclusions. If we wish to criticize an argument, we must take care to identify the most plausible interpretation of the argument before we begin. To do otherwise is to create what philosophers call a straw man. Teaching students to take seriously the arguments of those who they are inclined to disagree with is one of my most important goals. Take, for instance, the reading of Marx. For the better part of the last century, Marxism has been a bit of a bugbear in the mind of most Americans. Marxism is associated with communism, and communism with foreign rivals, Russia, China, Cuba, countries with many problems, including persistent histories of suppression of freedoms and abuse of human rights. But the principle of charity requires that we actually read Marx and read him in a way which makes his claims most rationally defensible. And if you do this, you'll see that Marx was an incredibly acute observer of the injustices created by the social and economic systems in place during his lifetime. You'll also see that much of what Marx says about the causes of injustice still ring true today. I am no Marxist, and I can find much to criticize both in his historical analysis and in his economic and political theory. But the principle of charity teaches me that Marx was neither a demon nor a fool, and his views cannot be dismissed out of hand. Now, I formulated the principle of charity as an injunction to interpret people's beliefs in a way to make them both true and rational. But a little reflection shows that truth and rationality do not always go together. To be rational means to pay attention to evidence and logic, to make sure that your beliefs are as consistent as possible. But rationality in this sense does not guarantee truth. Sometimes one might have good reasons to believe things that turn out to be false, or have no good reasons to believe something that turns out to be true. Consider the situation of a child who has not had the good fortune to grow up in a loving home. Perhaps his parents were incarcerated or otherwise unable to care for him. And suppose he has been bouncing around for years in unsuccessful foster placements. If you were to adopt such a child, you might find him to be very suspicious of your goodwill and commitment to him. It would be very hard to establish trust. Such a situation might be very difficult for you, but I'm sure you'd agree that it would not be charitable to blame the child for this situation. Given his persistent experience, the most reasonable thing to expect is that you will let him down in the same way that others have. As another case, consider my friend Andrew. Andrew is a devout religious conservative and a devotee of intelligent design theory. He is convinced that God had an active hand in creating the world and the creatures that populate it. I think that his beliefs in this regard are dead wrong. Not his belief in God per se, but his belief that God acts in the world in the way that he supposes. And in general, that we can find the evidence of God's work imprinted in nature in the way that he imagines. But even though I think his beliefs are wrong, charity requires me to look for the ways in which those beliefs are rational, to try to see where Andrew is coming from. When I look, what I see is someone who's quite serious about trying to make his beliefs consistent. His faith and religious experience make the reality of God and the truth of the teachings within his church to be undeniable to him. But he is no fool, and he recognizes that science is extraordinarily successful, and he cannot simply deny its truth. The attraction for him of intelligent design is that it seems to provide a way of accepting much of science while making room for the God he feels that he cannot deny. Ultimately, I think Andrew is mistaken about a lot, and that his mind is not really open to all the possibilities it should be. But as I said, he is no fool, and he is trying to make sense of his world. And I am sure that that is what Andrew thinks of me. So far, I have talked mostly about being charitable about the rationality and truth of beliefs. But another kind of charity, perhaps more familiar, is charity about a person's desires and motives. Here, the question is not about what you believe, but about what you want or what you are trying to do. Suppose you find that you were not invited to a party that your friend was having, a party where you had a right to expect an invitation. How should you interpret the snub? Perhaps your friend is mean, jealous, or capricious, not a true friend. Perhaps, but that is not a charitable interpretation. It could have been a technical error. Maybe an invite is sitting in your spam folder, or perhaps you mistyped your email address. It could also have been an unintentional omission. The charitable thing to do is to assume that your friend did not mean to slight you, or at least to withhold judgment until you can find out what happened. Charity in this sense is about giving someone the benefit of the doubt. When we think about giving people the benefit of the doubt, you can begin to see the connection between the Christian virtue of charity and the philosophical principle of charity. Both in a certain way are about honoring the other. But before we get too enthusiastic about charity, I want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about its dangers. Is charity always deserved? Is it always right to be charitable? Let me tell you a sad truth about college students. They cheat. They plagiarize. They sometimes pay to have other people write their papers. Estimating the extent of cheating is quite difficult, but multiple national surveys show that more than half of students report cheating each year. What is a teacher to do? Well, I will tell you what I do. First, I design things to make cheating both difficult and unprofitable. But after that, I give them the benefit of the doubt. I trust that they are generally truthful with me, that when they sign a pledge not to cheat, they mean it. I also trust them not to lie about other things. When I get an email about why they can't be in class, and I will tell you I get some real doozies, I still generally trust them. My charity is sometimes misplaced. I know I get played, but the reality is that often I cannot know if cheating or other kinds of lying are taking place. Both my trust and my suspicion could be undeserved. And given that I cannot avoid error, I default to trust. While I'm a big fan of the principle of charity, there's another principle that points us in a different direction and which deserves our attention. It sometimes goes by the name of the hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher and a leading figure in philosophical hermeneutics, was inspired by the works of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who he called the masters of suspicion. Ricoeur suggests that what is distinctive about these writers is their unwillingness to take what people say to face value. They sought to read between the lines and unmask a true but hidden meaning, to see through people's pretenses and to get to the sometimes unflattering core of their motivations. Any of us with experience of the world knows that people are not always to be trusted. In the political sphere, for instance, I am sure we can think of many politicians who do not deserve the least benefit of the doubt, peoples whose cynicism and cravenness seem to know no bounds. Or to take another example, that I'm afraid many of you are familiar with, consider what it's like to know an alcoholic or an addict. These afflictions sadly make liars of people, and much as you might want to trust them, you know that that trust may not be well placed. But the most interesting and tricky applications of the hermeneutics of suspicion are not in cases like these where we actually have evidence before us to substantiate our mistrust. Right now, I expect that many of you have heard about or even been involved in the kerfuffle going on about critical race theory in the public schools. Critical race theory, which is a part of critical theory, is grounded in the hermeneutics of suspicion. The critical theorist looks suspiciously beyond what people say they believe to look at what they actually do. Critical theorists are the ones who have pointed out, for instance, how many of our institutions, which are supposedly colorblind, whether it be our healthcare system, our legal system, our prison system, or our public schools, are in fact full of racial inequality. I doubt that many in Noblesville schools are in any explicit sense teaching critical race theory, but many efforts locally and nationally to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in public education are in fact informed in some ways by it. I think that parents who are protesting this are feeling the heat of that suspicion. They feel that their motives are being questioned. Uncomfortable as it can be, I'm afraid that I have to side in this case with the hermeneutics of suspicion. We must not take at face value the professed motives of others, or for that matter, of ourselves. We must peel back the layers and see if what we actually do advances or retards the cause of justice. So there is a time for suspicion and also a time for charity, and we aren't always going to get it right when we choose. But in the end, though, I am generally going to err on the side of charity, and I hope others do as well. Here is why I think it is so important. I cannot imagine that there is one of us who do not have friends, family members, or co-workers whose beliefs, values, and motivations at this time seem almost beyond comprehension. The tribalism of our time has divided us over masks and vaccines, immigrations and elections, abortions and women's reproductive rights, and so many other things. And these conflicts have strained the bonds of affection to the breaking point. When we see injustice, we must call it out and we must fight to change it. But when we look at those who we must fight, we must see not enemies, but friends, or we must at least, as Jesus told us, love our enemies, show them charity. That charity comes down to fighting the impulse to treat those whose behavior troubles us as either fools or demons. Whatever their blind spots, to see them as people like us trying to make sense of their world from a limited vantage point, people who by and large love their children no less than we, people who want to lead a life of meaning and purpose. This is a tall order. And I can only pray for all of you as I pray for myself, that we may find faith and hope, and greatest of all, charity.